devastating illness, horribly devastating plague that erupts in Europe here in the 14th century. We believe that it started as bubonic plague in China in the 1330s, and then eventually by the 1340s had made its way up through Italy and then into the rest of Europe. We have accounts of the plague in Avignon during the papal residence at this time. In March of 1348, it was estimated that 400 people died per day. 400 people died per day in Avignon in 1348. Over a 5-week span, there were 11,000 people who were buried in a cemetery that had been paid for by the Holy Father. 11,000 people over 5 weeks. We can't even really imagine that kind of devastation and that kind of death and how much of an effect that would have on society. 1/3 of the College of Cardinals in that 1 year of 1348 also perished by the plague. So this is impacting greatly the church. Now, unfortunately, many people in Western Europe reacted negatively against the Jewish people as a result of this plague. Pogroms erupted, unfortunately, throughout Europe because of the plague. People blaming them and their all of the so-called crimes that they had committed for God sending this devastating plague onto Western Europe. The church addressed this, though, very forcibly. Clement VI was Pope at the time in 1348, issued a papal bull where he said those who harassed Jews on account of the plague were to be excommunicated. So the church directly addressed this and said it's not appropriate to place blame on the Jewish people for the arrival of the plague. Now, the effects of the Great Plague, the Black Death, were many and were great for Europe. Clement VI also issued a report in 1358 where he sent people out to gather information and data throughout Europe to try to understand the huge effect that this plague had on Western Europe. What was the extent of the plague? How many people had died? And they come back with their reports. He issued this report in 1351 where he said that it's estimated that 23.8 million people died in Europe during this time. So almost 24 million people were killed as a result of the plague. About 31% of the total population in Catholic Europe at this time. An amazing amount of death that people had to wrestle and deal with. It's estimated that half the population in England were killed in 1 year as a result of the plague. Truly devastating. We've never experienced anything like that in our modern world, thank God. But it was a devastating, devastating effect. Now, one of the effects that the plague brought to the church in particular was that it robbed the church of most of its good clergy. Because what happened is the clergy during the plague, those who were good and those who actually lived their vocation to the full, would go out and would minister to the people who were sick. And so we have many religious communities and many parish priests die as a result of being in contact with people who had the plague, because they would go to their homes and they would minister to those who were sick. They would bury those who had died from the plague. So we have a good portion of the clergy and the religious dying as a result of the Great Plague, the Great Black Death. And so this obviously affects the church because it takes, as we know, a long time to form a priest. It takes a long time to form a good religious. And obviously those who are more in tune with their vocation, those who really desire to live their vocation to the full, would be the ones who went out and ministered. Those who were less, perhaps, authentic in living out their vocation and their holiness didn't minister and perhaps stayed at home. So what was left in the church was not the cream of the crop, so to speak, for both bishops and priests. And so that ends up having an effect as we move into our next time period of protesters and defenders, when a lot of abuse begins to come back into the church, abuse that had been addressed in previous times. So we know now that the popes are in Avignon. Now, how do they come back to Rome? How are they brought back to Rome? They live there for 70 years, but eventually they do come back to Rome. How do they come back? Well, they come back through the actions and activities and writings of one very important person in the history of the church, a great woman whom the Holy Spirit brought to the church. This is St. Catherine of Siena. St. Catherine of Siena was the 25th child of a wool dyer. So that was a very large family. We have 5, 6 children, 7 children now. We think, ooh, that's a large family. But 25 children, that's a large family, even for the time. She was a mystic who had locutions from Christ. She ultimately was also received from the Lord the invisible stigmata, meaning she had the wounds of our Lord, but they remained invisible while she was alive. They did not become visible until her death. But she suffered from the effects of these wounds. She was a lay woman, who was associated with the Dominican order because she was a Dominican tertiary, but was a laywoman. She was never an official religious. She never took, never professed vows. There was a period of time in her life where she ate nothing but the Blessed Sacrament. Her physical, bodily needs were nourished completely by the Blessed Sacrament. She ate no other food than just the Blessed Sacrament. She had such a great and intense relationship with Christ. She also had a very intense relationship with the Pope and wrote him letters frequently. And in these letters, she referred to him in very filial terms. She called him Daddy and our sweet Christ on earth. And she at times was very direct in her letters of what she wanted the Pope to do, as we'll see in a moment. She decided to try to bring the popes back to Rome, so she traveled to Avignon in 1376. Now, she didn't speak any French or Latin, so she took with her her confessor so he could translate for her. She goes to Avignon, she meets with Gregory XI, and urges him to come back to Rome. Gregory, as a result of her visitation, agrees to come back to Rome, at least when she's there. When she leaves and goes back to Siena, Gregory XI, through the manipulations of the French cardinals, begins to waver in his decision to go back to Rome. She hears of his wavering and that he's not making a quick enough departure for Avignon to Rome, so she writes him a letter. And this is what she says: "I beg of you, on behalf of Christ crucified, that you be not a timorous child, but manly. Open your mouth and swallow down the bitter for the sweet." Now, could you imagine writing a letter to Benedict XVI and saying, Benedict, come on, be a man here. Let's address the issue. Now, we can never really, we can't do that, but St. Catherine of Siena had that gravitas, had that, holiness about her where she could address the Holy Father in such a direct manner and in essence say to him, don't listen to these French advisors. They always say, we want to keep you in France. Leave, come back to Rome. This is where the Pope is supposed to live, is supposed to be. So eventually, he does listen to her, and he comes back to Rome on January of 1377, and the Avignon papacy is at an end. So the 70-year period of the popes living outside of Rome comes to the end through the actions of a great woman, one of the greatest women in the history of the church, in the history of the world, St. Catherine of Siena. As we've said, though, the popes living in Rome had a huge effect on the church and on Western Europe. It weakened people's respect for the Holy Father. It weakened people's loyalty even to the Holy Father. And this would even be further weakened, this respect and this loyalty would be even further challenged by the next great event that happens in the history of the church, this event called the Great Western Schism, where we have multiple people claiming to be popes at the same time. And if you look in your epic workbook, we have this is a very confusing time in church history. It's difficult to keep track of all the different characters and all the players that are involved in this event of the Great Western Schism. So in your epic workbook, we have, in the appendix, we have a chart that lists, that kind of gives us the basic background information of what's going on, what happens during this event, and who is who. Who are the people, who are the popes in Rome, who are the anti-popes in Avignon, and then who later are the anti-popes in Pisa. So we try to make it accessible in order to understand what's going on. Basically, this is what happened. That Gregory XI dies in March of 1378. And so the cardinals meet in conclave in 1378. Now, one of the effects of the Pope being in Avignon for so long was that the College of Cardinals were pretty much stacked with French people, with French men. So, right at this time in 1378, 16 cardinals gather together in conclave. Of the 16, 11 are French, 4 are Italian, and there's 1 Spaniard. So the vast majority of cardinals here are French. Now, the Roman people, the people of Rome, obviously wanted an Italian pope. Wanted someone of Italian descent to become the Holy Father, because they were afraid that if the French cardinals elected one of their own, that they would move the papacy back to France. And they did not want to see that happen. So there was a mob that kind of gathered outside outside where the cardinals were gathering, and for the conclave in order to ensure that they elected an Italian pope. They did elect an Italian pope, a man who took the name Urban VI. Now, Urban VI, unfortunately, ruled his cardinals with an iron fist. He was a very quick-tempered man, and a man who wanted to ensure discipline among all of his cardinals. And one of the things that he did was he was even verbally abusive to his cardinals. He called one a half-wit. He beat another with his cane. So he didn't really endear himself to his cardinals. These men are supposed to be his advisors. He also directed that no cardinal should eat meat, or should eat no more than one course per meal. So you only have one course per meal. Just trying to limit their caloric intake. Maybe he was concerned about their weight, but it really was an effort to try to have them be more penitential and practice more fasting. St. Catherine of Siena is still alive at this time. She heard about Urban VI and the way he was ruling the College of Cardinals, and he was creating a lot of dissension and angst among his cardinals. So she wrote him a letter to tell him to calm down and be a little bit more charitable. This is what she said: "For the love of Jesus crucified, Holy Father, soften a little the sudden movements of your temper." So just again, very direct, calm down. You're going to cause another major event if you continue to rule your cardinals this way. Well, unfortunately, he didn't listen to her, and 5 months later, the cardinals gather again together in a secret location, and they declare, the 11 French cardinals, 3 Italian cardinals, and 1 Spaniard cardinal. There was 1 Italian cardinal who would have nothing to do with this meeting. But the rest of them gathered together, and they said that their election of Urban VI was forced. They had been forced against their will to elect Urban VI. So it really wasn't a valid election, because it was a forced election. You can't be forced to do anything against your will. So they argued that therefore we were forced by this mob, so his election is not really valid. So they declare his election invalid, and they elect Cardinal Robert of Geneva to be Pope, or really anti-Pope. And so Robert of Geneva takes the name Clement VII. Now St. Catherine, still in the picture, she hears of what these cardinals had done, and she is just very upset. Very upset. So she writes them a letter, and she says to the 3 Italian cardinals in particular, and she says, "You clearly know the truth, that Pope Urban VI is truly Pope, chosen in orderly election, not influenced by fear. What made you do this?" Meaning, what made you declare that his election was invalid? The poison of self-love, which has infected the world. That is what makes you pillars lighter than straw, flowers which shed no perfume, but stench that makes the whole world reek. Now you want to corrupt this truth and make us see the opposite, saying that you chose Pope Urban from fear, which is not so. Return, return, and wait not for the rod of justice, since we cannot escape the hands of God. Now again, St. Catherine of Siena, not one to pull the punches. She directly addressed these Italian cardinals and basically said, "What are you doing? Why did you participate in this farce of declaring your election, which was valid, Pope Urban VI, of being invalid? You were pillars lighter than straw." It's a great image. Think about that. I mean, we think of a pillar, strong, concrete, structure that holds up buildings and other things, just strong. But she says they're pillars lighter than straw, that can just be blown in the wind and done whatever people want, very easily influenced. So she directly addresses them. So now we have what's known in history as the Great Western Schism. Pope Urban VI, validly elected Pope of Rome, but an anti-Pope, Robert of Geneva. And this whole event, and the whole ramifications of this event, are going to affect the Church in Western Europe for the next generation, for the next 40 years. It's going to it's one of the main events that lays the foundation and the seed for the Protestant Revolution in our next time period. Now what happened, though, among all the secular rulers during this time in Western Europe is that some rulers backed the Pope in Rome, some backed the anti-Pope Clement VII. Because Clement VII was French, the King of France backed him. So you have the French nation and French Catholics being told that the real Pope is Clement VII. Then you have others who backed Urban VI, England, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Hungary at this time, and Poland, all backed Urban VI. So now we have Christendom, which had been united, at least in faith, is now completely fractured in faith. And we have this great schism, and people backing nations, backing different popes, causing a lot of confusion for the people. Now Urban VI excommunicates Clement VII, and he replaces his entire College of Cardinals. He throws out all of the 11 French cardinals, the 3 Italian cardinals, and the 1 Spaniard, and then brings it into being a new College of Cardinals. Anti-Pope Clement VII declares war on Urban VI and marches an army to Rome to try to depose him and get rid of him once and for all. He besieges Rome. Fortunately, his army is defeated. He flees to Naples, and then eventually he settles in Avignon. So we have now not only a schism, two different men claiming to be the authentic pope, now we have these two different men warring against one another. Again, this whole period, as I mentioned in the beginning, is all about popes and those claiming to be pope acting like secular princes more than as the universal shepherd of the Christian people. There was an opportunity to end the schism when Urban VI died in 1389, and he was replaced by Boniface IX. Now there's an opportunity to end the schism when anti-pope Clement VII dies in 1394. So those French cardinals and a few Italian cardinals who gathered together and invalidly elected Clement VII had an opportunity to end the schism now. Because they could have said, all right, we're done, Clement VII has died, we're now going to back the true pope, the pope in Rome, the newly elected Boniface IX. Instead, they don't do that, and they elect another anti-pope. And this person is Benedict XIII. And he actually is the one Spaniard that was involved in the original conclave of 1378. His name was Pedro de Luna, and he takes the name Benedict XIII. Now what happens in Europe as a result, and in the church as a result of this great Western schism, is we see a rise of a heresy known as conciliarism. And what conciliarism is basically the heresy that says an ecumenical council has more authority and is of a superior position in the church than the Pope. Again, this was an effort to try to end this crisis, to say that the real authority in the church, the superior authority in the church, belongs to the bishops and the people of the church gathered together in an ecumenical council, not to the Holy Father. And so this was proposed by members of the faculty, the theology faculty of the University of Paris. And again, it was an attempt, first of all, to try to end the schism, but ultimately it's a heretical movement that would affect the church for the next several generations. It ultimately was condemned, this notion of conciliarism was condemned as a heresy by the Ecumenical Council, the Fifth Lateran Council, in the 16th century. Now, the cardinals they know that the church in Western Europe are greatly affected by the Great Western Schism, so these French and Italian cardinals gather together in Pisa to try to resolve the crisis and resolve the issue once and for all. This is in 1409. So what they do is, these French and Italian cardinals meet, they agree to depose Benedict XIII and Gregory XII, who is now the new pope in Rome. They call them notorious schismatics and heretics, and excommunicate both of them. They also then say that the cardinals have supreme authority in the church, and they are now going to elect a new pope. All the cardinals present at this meeting of Pisa get together and elect a new pope. And so they elect a man who takes the name Alexander V. So now we have not two people claiming to be pope, but we have three people claiming to be pope. And the same thing happens, that we mentioned earlier, that we have different nations of Europe, different monarchs, different rulers throughout Western Europe backing each of these different men. So Europe is just fractured in unity. The whole high watermark of Christendom was in our last time period of crusaders and scholars, where Europe was really, although there were exceptions, for the most part, Western Europe was united with the church, and Western European rulers really focused on the papacy and what the Pope wanted them to do. Now, unfortunately, we have the situation where a lot of respect and authority and prestige has been lost by the popes because of their move to Avignon, and now we have even more loss of prestige and respect because of this great Western schism. Now, this is confusing for us to keep track of all these different popes and anti-popes coming in and out of the picture, and 2 people and 3 people. Just imagine how confusing it would have been for people living at the time. How would you know who was the right pope? People you respected, maybe your own bishop was saying, well, this person's the pope. Maybe that person was not the real pope, but an anti-pope. It is important to note, though, during this whole time, there was really only one validly elected pope. So sometimes we'll have people come to us, especially maybe some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, and say, oh, you Catholics are strange, you believe in this papacy, and even at one time there were 3 people who were pope. And one of the things that you should say back to them when they say that to you is say, well, that's not really true. There were 3 people who claimed to be pope, only one of which was actually pope. So we can have as many anti-popes as you want. There's only one who is the actually real, validly elected successor to St. Peter. And we even saw that, remember, in the early part of the church's history with St. Hippolytus, who became the first anti-pope. and who also tried to break away from the church and not recognize the authority of the Pope. So these anti-popes have existed before. It's just now it's much more intense, and there are a lot more of them during this period. So the cardinals gather at Pisa. They've elected another anti-pope.